She was only cleaning the barracks until a general found out what she'd done in the dark. Maria Dawson pushed her mop bucket through the corridor of Fort Brigham the way she always did, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes on the floor, trying to be the quietest sound in a building designed for loud orders. The night air smelled like disinfectant and metal. She liked the rhythm of the late shift. Wet mop, squeeze, draw a line, step aside. The hall polished up to a quiet sheen, and the bass breathed around her. Distant HVAC thrum, a vending machine clicking, one lone television murmuring inside a break room she never entered. She'd learned years ago that staying invisible kept life simple. Her son, Luis, texted at 22:11, "Got algebra done. Sleepy. Love you, Mom." She typed with a rubber glove thumb, "Love you more," and tucked the phone into her back pocket. The screen pressed against her hip as she moved past the door marked Barracks C. Authorized personnel only. She was not authorized, but night cleaning contracts were the invisible exception to every door. She had a badge that opened most of them, and for those it didn't, there was always someone who waved her through without looking up. She did not look like anyone a base would remember. Brown hair captive in a practical bun. Gray polo with the crooked company logo. Jeans that never seemed to get truly clean. Sneakers whose soles squeaked only when the floors were perfect. She was 41, with the steady balance of someone who had stood on buses for years, a mother's patience in her jawline, and the sort of gaze that never lingers where it doesn't belong. She had worked in hospitals, offices, hotels. Fort Brigham paid worse than the hospital had, but the hours were steady, and there was a small dignity in leaving a place better than she found it. Soldiers nodded at her sometimes. Most never saw her at all. At 23:41, she found a scuffed trail of mud arcing in ribs across the hall outside the laundry, proof a platoon had returned late and stomped their way to showers. She filled the yellow bucket at a janitor's sink, laced a capful of degreaser into the water, and went to work. She liked the way the mess surrendered. Warm water bloomed gray, and her mop made little commas as she lifted grit away. She moved methodically, the way she folded sheets at home, the way she'd learned to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. The bass was quiet enough that she heard her own breath and counted strokes without meaning to. 68, 69, 70. The lights blinked, just a flutter at first, as if a storm had touched a too distant wire. She stilled. The ceiling hummed. The fluorescent tubes steadied. She waited and resumed. At 23:47, they blinked again, 2 sharp beats, and half of them went dead at once. The corridor shrank into a tunnel, illuminated only by a staggered line of emergency exit signs glowing a green that made the walls look like sleep-deprived skin. Somewhere far away, a generator tried to wake and didn't. Maria's pulse found a new rhythm. Bases didn't go dark. Redundancy sat on redundancy like armor. She knew that from picking up conversations, from mopping under briefing monitors that wore acronyms like medals. Lights here were supposed to survive anything short of Armageddon. She heard it then, footsteps that didn't belong to the space. Not the lazy swing of night shift MPs, not the heavy clip of boots heading for the motor pool. These steps were deliberate and quiet, as if the people making them were trying to erase themselves while moving. Maria slid her cart to the wall, set the mop handle down silently, and moved to the supply closet without looking like she was moving to the supply closet. She eased the door just wide enough for her body, made herself thin, and left a pencil-thin slit to the hall. 3 men came out of the stairwell. Their uniforms were not uniforms at all. Sleek, matte, built to swallow light. No flags, no name tapes, no unit patches. Masks softened their faces into animals with eyes behind black lenses. Each carried a compact carbine with something fat on the muzzle. Their movements matched in a language that didn't require sound. A point, a nod, a 2-finger slice meaning split and sweep. The first man tested a door with a gloved hand and didn't bother with a key. A tool flashed, and the latch surrendered in less than a heartbeat. Maria didn't realize she had stopped breathing until her lungs demanded air. She pulled it in carefully so it wouldn't scrape. She thought of walking out with both hands up, saying I'm just cleaning, saying you don't even have to see me. But she stayed because their silence scared her more than their guns. They didn't pause to check around corners. They already knew the corners. They didn't look up at the cameras in corners of the ceiling. They moved as if the cameras had already been told to blink. When they were gone, the hall felt wider and thinner at once. Maria eased the door open, but the sound that stopped her came from behind her, soft, raw, not part of the mechanical building. She turned and saw a shape slumped at the end of the hall, half behind the vending machine. She almost didn't process the camouflage before she saw the dark smear on tile. "Hey," she whispered, not ready to be louder than the emergency signs, and crossed the floor. He was just a kid, any kid, a private whose name tape blurred under sweat. He had curly hair matted to his forehead and a torn sleeve. She pressed her palm beside his collarbone to feel the tremble that meant life. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found the polo and the mop bucket like he had to solve a riddle. His lips shaped air. She leaned close. The word he made was armory. Other words came, broken and wet. 2. North. Jammer. No radio. "What's your name?" she asked. It mattered to say a name in a corridor where you could become nobody. "Private Haynes," he managed. Retched a breath. "I tried, Don't," she said. "Talking is for when we've got you behind a door." She dragged his weight with the leverage of someone who'd hoisted too many laundry bags. Arm under his armpits, heel braced against tile. The supply closet door banged lightly as she nudged it with her foot. Inside, she levered him down between shelves of bleach and toilet paper and the wrapped rolls of trash liners that always felt like backup parachutes. She looked at his sleeve and at the blood. Training from endless online first aid videos rose like a muscle memory she'd practiced privately in case something happened at home. She tore a stack of microfiber rags, made a wad, pressed hard above the wound, bound the pressure with brown packing tape across his upper arm until he hissed, and then steadied. She took his radio and lifted it to her ear. Dead, but not quiet, the kind of snow that meant something crushed the signal flat. She had a mop, a bucket, a flashlight, a dead radio, and a soldier who looked like her son would look in 3 years if she blinked too long. "You stay," she said. "I'll be back." Haynes caught her wrist with fingers that were cold inside their heat. "Don't." He tried for more words and failed. He shook his head and closed his eyes. She put the flashlight between her teeth, grabbed the mop handle like it was a spear, and rolled her cart back into the greenlit world. She didn't have a plan. She had a direction, north, the way the kid had said, and the sort of attention that made the edges of everything too crisp to be real. 2 intruders toward the armory. Others? Unknown. She moved with the cart as a shield, listening to the building's language. A door whispering closed felt like it had just let someone pass. An elevator that wasn't supposed to run at night purred with its panel dead. The smell of hot dust came from somewhere it never came from. She thought of calling 911 on her phone and had it half out before she imagined the operator's first question, "What's your emergency?" and the line of patchwork lies it would require. The time it would take for outside sirens to find a military gate. The fact that her phone would light bright as a flare in this darkness and make her a target for any eye. She slid her phone to airplane mode to keep it from betraying her and thought of Luis asleep with his old headphones on, the ones she'd mended with tape. She pictured the way he had looked at her when she'd said she'd take the base job. "You're not scared of soldiers?" She'd said she was scared of bills, as if fear could be measured like that. Voices breathed around the turn ahead. She killed the cart's motion with a gloved hand and angled the mop so it lay along the bucket's rim. She eased forward 2 inches at a time until the corner gave her a sliver view. One of the masked men knelt by a panel. His hands were gentle with it, sure the way a good mechanic treated anything that could break only once. Another stood facing away, his carbine at a low ready, scanning a hallway that ended in a steel door with an eye-level pass-through and a small red placard that said armory in letters that always looked sterile until you needed them. Between the door and the man, a rectangle on the ceiling glowed faintly, humming like summer insects. Jammer. She didn't know the gear, but she knew the look of a machine that wanted a bubble of silence. She studied spaces and weights like she did when moving a too-heavy sofa by herself. The cart would roll, the bucket would slosh, the men would pivot. Everything her body knew told her to shrink and disappear. But an anger had begun under her sternum. The indignity of men in masks occupying a place she'd polished for people who slept above it thinking they were safe. Rage sharpened to something colder than fear. She pushed off the wall and gave the cart the gentlest shove. It rolled into the corridor, quiet on rubber casters until it hit a scuffed seam and hiccuped a squeak. The standing man's head flicked toward the sound. then ironed itself back forward as if the building had only creaked. The kneeling man didn't pause. She took the second she had bought with a squeak and put her left foot flat, right foot back the way she had when she'd swung brooms at feral dogs in the alley outside a motel in Fresno. She gripped the mop handle near the end and the middle, exhaled so her chest wouldn't betray her, and came around the corner in 3 fast steps. The standing man turned with professional speed. She stepped into the swing and drove the mop head, still wet, heavy with chemical, into his face with the full extension of her shoulders and hips. The weight of water amplified the blow. The head struck like a sandbag. His hands came up, not to shoot, but to reclaim his eyes. She shoved the handle, twisting like she was plunging a toilet, until the plastic grip ground across his mask and into soft tissue underneath. He staggered into the wall and screamed behind fabric. The kneeling man spun. She didn't look at him because looking meant fear. She threw the metal bucket, a reflex learned from 1,000 kitchens and 1,000 small bad nights. Water and degreaser lifted off tile like a slapping wind and splashed his hands and face. The bucket itself hit the jammer with a clanging grace note and knocked it sideways so the hum went ragged, and for one miraculous half-second, the hallway's silence changed character. Her radio, forgotten in her pocket, crackled like a lightning bug coming back to life. The kneeling man fired once, but the shot went wild into the ceiling because his eyes chose chemistry over marksmanship. The standing man reached for her on blind instinct, and she answered with the only thing left in her hand. She jabbed the mop handle straight down into his knee, exactly where the patella was smart and breakable. He went down with a pop and a curse that had no language. His gun clattered. She kicked it under a bench without thinking and tried to run and didn't, because turning her back on the other man meant nothing good. He found her in the blur. He was bigger than she was, smoother, both hands hard. He hit her shoulder and pushed her into the cinder block hard enough that sparks lived at the edges of her vision. The world shrank to smell. Industrial lemon cleaner, heated rubber, the ghost sour of adrenaline in her mouth. He pinned her left wrist with a knee and reached for her throat. She remembered classes from the Y years ago where the instructor had said, if it's stronger than you, don't fight the muscle, fight the structure. She hooked her right foot behind his ankle and shoved at his hip, not his chest. He fell awkwardly sideways as his boots slipped on the soup she had made of the floor. She slid out from under him and found the flashlight she had dropped when the world turned into a sudden brawl. She thumbed it on and jammed the beam into his eyes. He recoiled reflexively, his pupils becoming pain. She brought the flashlight down like a hammer across the knuckles of the hand that still sought her. Something in his hand made a popping sound like the lid of a jar giving up. She held the light like a club and didn't stop until he stopped trying to get up. The standing man did something that sounded like crying through a cloth. She kicked the jammer again, and the hum died like a bee finally crushed. The radio in her pocket cracked wide awake. 2 voices stepping on each other, then a third shouting for clarity. Maria sank to her knees behind the cart, panting in small, economical breaths, and pulled the radio out. Barracks C, North Hall, she said. She didn't know the right words, but clarity mattered more than vocabulary. Multiple intruders. Masks. Silenced weapons. 1 down, 1 injured. Armory corridor. I am. She almost said I am a cleaner and hated how small the sentence felt. I need immediate response and medical for 1 soldier down near the laundry. Who is this? A voice demanded. Identify. Someone who's not going to outlast their magazines if you take too long, she said, the line of sarcasm surprising her. Move. The corridor answered with a door slamming open somewhere close but wrong. She dragged the downed man's weapon by its sling and slid it toward the corner like a contemptuous offering to no one. She didn't want it. She wanted the flashlight, the mop handle, and the knowledge of where the floor was slick now. She searched the kneeling man's gear one-handed, found a pair of zip ties like small white bones, and bound both men's wrists behind their backs with the unsentimental competence she'd learned restraining a fever-mad patient once in a job she'd promised herself she'd forget. She rose, every joint suddenly aware of its job in a human body, and moved toward the armory door. It had its own logic and would not negotiate. She tested it, found it deadlocked. She put her ear to the steel and thought she heard, underneath the building's slow exhale, a sound like the air itself waiting. 2 intruders, north. maybe already past some other entrance. She looked down the intersecting corridor. Exit signs glowed. A fire alarm pull station waited red and dumb on the wall, and a camera in a corner watched her like an old friend that wasn't allowed to help. She pulled the alarm. The handle stuck for a fraction of a second like everything that mattered resisted first contact, then gave with a snap. The siren's birth howl tried to tear the ceiling off. Red strobes beat at the edges of the world. Somewhere deep, a panel began telling another panel what to tell a third one. Doors that liked being lax at night decided to become serious. Sprinkler pipes thought about water. The radio screamed with overlapping voices and a single sudden line of command that made everything else get out of the way. All units, repeat. All units, security breach barracks C, QRF scramble. Fire suppression override. Do not activate sprinkler. Repeat, do not activate. Maria took her flashlight and ran back the way she had come, because leaving Haynes alone felt like abandoning a promise. The siren made distance hard to judge. Her legs measured it instead, counting strides she didn't know she'd counted 1,000 times. She reached the supply closet and slid inside. Haynes had fought to stay upright. He looked at the alarm lights sweeping the shelves and tried to stand. "Don't be stupid," she said, softer than the world would tolerate. She checked his tape tourniquet and found blood had decided to respect it. She took a bottle of saline from a shelf because once she had used it on a different kind of mess and discovered it was the miracle water. She wet a cloth and cleaned his face from hairline to jaw like he was 5. His eyes unblurred around the edges. "You did good," he whispered. "You did better," she answered. "You used your one word exactly right. They going for the—" "Not tonight," she said. "Help is coming." "Who are you?" "Maria," she said, because it was the only honest thing. She pressed his uninjured hand to the wad of cloth. "Hold. If you drop pressure, I'm going to yell at you." He smiled a crooked little smile, which meant he might live. She went back into the hall because hiding forever felt like letting the worst things set the rules. The siren's beat changed as the system realized there wasn't any heat that meant fire, which meant someone with a badge had already found the panel, which meant good hearts were running. The floor shook slightly with booted weight. She heard the quick reaction force long before she saw them. A pack of controlled motion, weapons up, light cones probing the strobing red like surgical instruments. The lead soldier took her in with a glance that moved like a scan. Center mass, hands, face, floor, threats. He pivoted his body to block her from a hypothetical line of fire down the hall she'd come from even while the rest of his team flowed around her like a river around a rock. "Hands," he said, not unkindly, and she showed him empty palms and a flashlight. "You the caller?" "Cleaner," she said, and then, louder because the siren didn't care. Two restrained near the armory corridor. One shooter blinded, other knee taken. "Jammer down." He stared for a beat as if the nouns had delivered themselves out of order. "Show." She did, walking on the dry edges of the corridor because the wet places were traps now. She pointed with the light rather than a finger because that felt safer to everyone. The team's second man checked the jammer with a toe like you'd check a dead snake. "Cobbled import," he said into his mic, directions unknown. "It's down." Another soldier rolled the kneeling man with 2 fingers and a knee. "Alive." The team moved with a choreography that made Maria ache with a weird kind of envy. The luxury of a plan executed by many hands together. "Medical to the closet," Maria shouted, turning to point, and one of the rear operators peeled off to follow her directions. She watched him kneel by Haynes, speak the language of good medics, steady, bored, calm, and start the steps that turned bleeding into a list instead of a sentence. The QRF leader touched his earpiece and said, "Two at my position, restrained. Sweep ongoing." Then to her, "You got a name?" "Maria Dawson." "You armed?" "No." "You injured?" "Later," she said, surprised to hear herself smile. Her shoulder had begun to complain about cinder block, and her palms felt like she had stripped them on gravel. She was aware of wet at her temple that might be blood or might be cleaner. The siren lights tattooed the hallway. Everyone in it looked like they had been cut from a red negative. "Stay with us," the leader said, which sounded like kindness and doctrine at once. "You don't move unless I tell you. I run the other way if you tell me to," she said. "We might take you up on that." They did. 2 corridors down, where the armory's main door made the wall into a prohibition, a second set of intruders had found a utility chase that someone had drawn on a map long before Maria was born, and they'd used it like a remembered prayer. The overt breach team that had come from the north hadn't expected a janitor's bucket and a woman with rage enough to turn chemicals into weapons. The ghost team from the chase had expected no one at all. They hit the final elbow of the chase and found a grate that looked like a grate until you loved it wrong. Then it looked like a mouth. They'd taken it off and slid into the hall behind an armory door that believed itself safe from anything but the keys of its masters. They met the QRF in a stitch of seconds that felt longer than their lives. Maria didn't see the first moments. She heard them. The percussive cough of suppressed rifles, answering barks not suppressed at all, the slap of bullets hitting cinder block, and the wild tick of ricochet as a wall revealed it was also part steel. The QRF leader shoved Maria into a niche and stood in front of her as if his body was a policy. She wanted to tell him not to be stupid. She wanted him to live even if she didn't know his name. She pressed her hand to the floor to stop it from shaking through her bones and realized she had knelt in something slick. She wiped her palm on her jeans and stood because staying down felt like surrender. She did what she could do. She forced herself to think like a cleaner again. She mapped the hall for every piece of leverage a body could use. She saw, at the base of a fire extinguisher island, the jagged tongue of a metal plate that had lifted from the floor over time. She grabbed it and ripped it up. It screamed against its own screws. It was a noise both teams would remember later, the shriek of a building complaining about being used as a weapon. She ran with the plate like a shield and slid it into the corridor's line of fire at knee height. Bullets smacked it and changed their minds. One of the masked men stepped to clear the makeshift barrier and found his ankle in the bite of its corner because Maria dragged it fast as he moved. He pinwheeled with his silencer, chasing a target that had decamped from where physics said it should be, and a QRF rifle found him with a loud answer that ended his argument. Another intruder tried to leap the plate and landed on a cleaner's perfect sheen. His foot skated sideways and sent his muzzle skyward long enough for a flashbang to arrive and make arguments irrelevant. Maria crawled behind the plate while the team surged. She could see the intruder's eyes through his mask. They were young and shiny and unremarkable in a way that made them terrible. She had a sudden, hideous thought. He had been a boy with a math teacher once. She almost froze under the weight of it, then remembered Haynes's blood and Louis's headphones and used the plate's edge to hook the fallen intruder's sling and drag the weapon out of his reach. For the second time that night, she cursed the intimate architecture of guns, how they balanced, how they wanted to be picked up. She laid it down on the wrong side of the fight, like a feral thing she didn't want near her shoes. When it ended messily, and then all at once. The team stacked on the chase access, a door that didn't know whether it was a door, and flooded it with light and commands. The remaining intruder made a decision that sounded like a last resort and fired into that light anyway. The light moved sideways and answered, and then there was only the siren and the human sounds that came after intensity. People counting, swearing softly, saying I'm good, saying I got you, saying breathe. The armory door stood there the whole time with its idiot confidence, unaware of the world collapsing and reforming inches from its hinges. The general arrived because of course he did. Generals appear the way thunder does once lightning has already taken notes. He came fast, coat half on, boots laced by hands that had done it in moving vehicles. He carried nothing but presence and a voice that made everyone else move 1 degree sharper. He took in the corridor with a single long blink. He saw the zip-tied intruders against their will. He saw a jammer that had lost its will to hum. He saw a steel plate turned into furniture and a cleaner standing behind it with the shape of a flashlight imprinted in her hand. He walked to Maria with the walk of a man who had been measured by many people and found the measurement funny. He stopped 3 feet away, because 3 feet is close enough to feel a body's heat and far enough that 2 breaths can live without fighting. He didn't ask if she was all right. His eyes had already answered it for him. He looked at the mop handle leaning against the wall like a spent javelin, looked at the bucket, looked at the streaks of foam drying in random constellations across the tile. "Miss Dawson," he said. It startled her that he knew her name. Then it didn't. People like him knew the roster of their roofs better than their enemies hoped. "Is there any part of this story I am not going to believe?" "Yes," she said. "The part where I was brave." He tilted his head the way you do when a dog says a word. What do you call this? I call it not wanting to tell a mother in the morning that her kid bled out in a closet while I hid behind paper towels. He nodded once, the slowest thing in the hall. He looked at Haynes on a gurney passing within 4 pole, leading like a small antenna for hope. Is he yours? The general asked. It was an unfair question and perfect. He is somebody's, she said. Tonight he's mine. The general's mouth became a straight sentence. He turned to the QRF leader. Secure every inch between here and the north lot, he said. Nobody leaves this perimeter without my signature and a small biography. Get EOD on that jammer. I want its cousins. I want the family photo and the Christmas letter. He turned back. Ms. Dawson, would you like to sit down? If I do, I might not get up, she said. Then stand with me, he answered, and they stood together while the hall turned back into a place where people could breathe. She went with the medics when they asked her to, not because she wanted to be touched by strangers, but because someone needed to document the shaking in her hands in case later she didn't remember its magnitude. They cleaned the thin cut in her hairline and the skin flayed from 3 knuckles. They found bruises arriving like weather forecasts on both shoulders. A nurse told her to count backward from 100 and laughed when she said, 100, 99, I have to pick up my son at 7:97. The nurse patted her hand and said, we'll call someone to call someone. They took her statement in a room that didn't belong to statements. A coffee machine hissed at her like an old cat. The military police captain had the weary grace of someone who understood that stories told in shock are truer than stories told after counsel. He didn't interrupt when she described the bucket, the chemicals, the way the flashlight felt when it became heavy as a decision. He asked 3 questions that mattered. Did you see a tattoo? Did you hear a language? Did anything smell familiar, like a cologne or a brand of cigarettes? She answered no, Spanish curses maybe, and degreaser and fear. He wrote the last answer down. At 3:12, they led her to a break room where the coffee stopped hissing long enough to deliver something that was almost a mercy. She called Luis. He didn't pick up. He never did on the first ring. On the second, he answered hello like it was a challenge. It's me, she said. Her voice felt too large and too small for the word. I'm okay. I'm safe. I'll be late. You always are, he said. And then, hearing the strange in her, what happened? Just work, she said, because what else could it be? Lock the door. Get some more sleep. I love you. I love you too, he said, and added, don't clean their whole war by yourself. She laughed, and the laugh hurt her ribs. She slept 20 minutes in a chair that had made more liars of backs than any chair should. She woke to movement that was purposeful but no longer frantic. The siren had died sometime, while she dreamed of a floor that wouldn't stop moving. The general wanted to see her again. People with clipboards wanted to attach their gravity to her orbit. She signed things that said she had told them true. Every time she signed, she thought of the intruder's eyes and wrote her name with a steadier hand than she felt. By sunrise, the base was a rumor that had eaten itself. The official story would say an attempted theft had been interrupted by alert personnel. The real story, the one that had a mop in it, moved along the grapevine like electricity chooses copper. A cook gave her an extra muffin she didn't want because her mouth tasted like pennies. A mechanic she'd said hello to in 100 hallways said, Ms. Dawson, and his voice cracked on the second word. A captain she'd never see again told her his wife's name when he didn't have to, as if trading names made strangers less sharp. 2 days later, in a hangar that felt like a church because people decided it would, the base gathered. Not a formation, exactly. A congregation of hands in pockets and shoulders bumping and boots trying not to shift. The general stood at a lectern that had been fetched from a room that discouraged dust. Flags hung correctly. A band in the corner held instruments like questions. Maria wore clothes she owned that pretended to be formal, a blouse that had never met sweat and shoes that believed in sitting. She had argued against coming and lost because she didn't know how to refuse kindness without damaging it. The general told a story. He did not say her name until he had said every other detail, as if the name should come last the way dessert does. He called what she had done a reminder that courage is a social construct. We decide who owns it, and we are frequently wrong. He said a line she would remember on bad days. Rank is a tool. Valor is a verb. Then he said her name and asked her to step forward, and the hangar made a sound like breath returning after being underwater too long. He pinned a medal where the crooked company logo would have been if she had worn her polo. The ribbon felt foolish and heavy. He took a half step back and saluted her. Not a sloppy salute meant for photographs, not a casual gesture of theater. The clean, exact movement that meant a body had decided to honor another body for real. He held it until her hands figured out where to be. The hanger did the rest. Hundreds of hands to browse, hundreds of eyes finding water they pretended not to have. After, the wives and husbands and partners of soldiers hugged her the way families do at airports. Haynes stood on crutches and said, "Ma'am, I told my mom you kept me alive." She asked if his mother had believed him. He said, "She cried and made me soup over FaceTime." A corporal asked if she had military training before she became a cleaner. She said she had worked 2 jobs at once for 3 years and learned to prioritize under fire. The band played a piece that didn't know whether to be solemn or proud and chose both. Luis stood at her side in a borrowed shirt too big for him, hands in his pockets, eyes not leaving her face. When he thought no one was looking, he wiped at his cheek with his shoulder like a boy who still remembered how not to be seen. Life, indifferent to ceremony, insisted on returning to itself. Bills arrived. The washing machine coughed once and died. Maria stood in a laundromat again, listening to the spin cycle like an ocean that never reached shore. Strangers recognized her sometimes. A woman at the grocery store put a hand on her arm near the bananas and said thank you with an urgency that didn't match the fruit. A man online said she was a plant, a fake, a piece of theater meant to distract the public, and she laughed until the laugh turned into something else and set the phone down to look at her hands instead. The base improved its locks on places that believed themselves invulnerable. The MP captain stopped her once in a hall and said, "You know, you embarrassed about 6 different budget lines." She said, "Good. Tell them a mop did it." At night, sometimes, she woke to the memory of the masked man's eyes. She learned that guilt doesn't care about sides. She told herself 1,000 true things. They came to hurt. They were paid to break. She had protected children. Truths didn't always soothe. On those nights, she sat at the kitchen table with the light off and listened to the building breathe. Luis padded out and sat across from her and didn't ask, because good sons know when silence is already full. He'd slide his foot over until the toe of his sock touched hers like a tether. She would pretend to be annoyed and he would pretend not to see her smile. Months later, a letter arrived from a woman whose return address had no rank. Inside was a photograph of a dog-eared family, parents and 3 kids in a row like stairs. On the back, "Thank you for keeping him. We are still a family because you stayed." Maria stared at the ink until the words swam and then fixed again. She put the photo in the drawer with her lease and the birth certificate and the envelope of emergency 20s that was never as fat as it needed to be. It felt right there, under the things that made a life possible. The investigation eventually found its nouns. The intruders had been hired through a chain that changed phones like snakes change skin. Someone wanted to test the base, not just rob it. A probing of readiness, an essay about weaknesses turned in by men whose grammar was violence. The jammer was traced to a shipment that had trotted around the world in crates that said industrial lighting. The lesson briefings used phrases like soft ingress and low signature exploitation. In none of the slides did the word cleaner appear, though the general said it to himself every time the slides pretended they were the whole truth. He saw Maria sometimes when his circuits took him from office to hangar to barracks to the edge of town, where he pretended he had a normal life. She would be where she had always been, in a hallway with a bucket, listening to the building, a metronome for a place that could otherwise forget its pulse. He would nod. She would nod back. Once he stopped and said, "You could teach," and she said, "I do." And he looked puzzled until she added, "Luis. Algebra. Boundaries." He laughed and said, "Send him to my office when he breaks one." And she said, "General, he's 16. And he said, "So was I once." And the joke sat between them like a handshake. On the anniversary, the base did not do a ceremony. It did something stranger and truer. The first sergeant in charge of Barracks C had the floors stripped and waxed by his own hand with 3 volunteers, and when Maria showed up at 2,200 with her bucket, the hall shone like a lake at night. There was a note taped to the wall with blue painter's tape so it wouldn't hurt the paint. It said, "Your night off. See you tomorrow." She stood and read it twice, and then went home and put her feet up and let the silence be a gift instead of a symptom. She tried to explain it once to a reporter who had waited politely in the parking lot until she finished her shift, a woman with gentle eyes who asked permission 3 different ways. "What did you feel?" the reporter asked. Maria wanted to say, "Everything, and none of it in order." She wanted to say that even in the worst moment, she had a ridiculous thought about whether the mop head could go through the washer or if she'd have to request a new one. She wanted to say that heroes are just people who ran out of other options while someone was watching. Instead, she said, "I felt like if I didn't do something, then I would have to live with that version of me, and I didn't want to meet her." The reporter nodded as if she'd been waiting all day to hear exactly that. The piece aired in a 3-minute segment between a story about a pothole and a story about a dog who had learned to skateboard. Maria liked that. The way things had to sit next to other things, big and small, ridiculous and necessary, all of them trying to be a day. When she walked past the armory corridor at night now, the camera in the corner looked at her with its glass eye, and she looked back and gave it the tiniest nod, because this was their shared hallway. They had survived it together. The fire alarm handle had been replaced. It gleamed like a tooth. She never touched it except sometimes with her gaze, a touch that said, "I remember you." And the general, because someone will ask what he did, made calls that moved budgets like continents and whispered in rooms where whispers matter. New protocols wrote themselves with language that remembered janitors. Emergency drills included civilians who had always existed and were now visible. A form somewhere sprouted a line for night contract staff contact, and Maria's phone number lived in it. Though she would never be woken for anything as simple as a drill, she had already borne the real thing. In his office, behind a photograph of a unit in a country that had since renamed itself, he kept a second photograph, a yellow bucket's shadow stretched across a green-lit hall. He looked at it on days when the job wanted to separate him from what jobs are for. Sometimes, when she finished a shift and the sky outside the barracks turned the color of new coins, Maria stood at the door and breathed in the morning. She would text Luis, "Wake up," and he would text back, "No," and then "Good," and they would begin again. She thought of the intruders less and of the kids sleeping behind these walls more. She thought of the way bodies move together when they trust each other, of the way courage sometimes needs a mop in its hand to know what shape to take. She didn't notice when people stopped calling her the cleaner who saved the armory and started calling her by her name without qualifiers. That is the quietest kind of honor. If you ask her what happened that night, she will tell you she did some cleaning. She will tell you about the messes that appear when people forget they are human and the tools that are good for scraping them up. She will tell you about a private who wanted to live and a son who wanted math to make sense and a general who saluted the idea that there are roles in the world more important than rank. She will not tell you about the moment she thought she might die, not because she is hiding it, but because she refused to let that moment be the point. She was only cleaning the barracks until the dark asked for something else, and she answered. And long after the hangar emptied and the metal found the back of a drawer and the bucket was replaced with another yellow bucket indistinguishable to anyone but her, the hallways remembered. At night, if you stand in Barracks C and listen very closely between the hum of the lights and the sleep of young soldiers, you can hear a soft rhythm of water and a woman's breath, and you will feel safer without knowing exactly why.